Hey everyone. So the other day, Roster Resource went through on their Twitter account and named the best contract on all 31 NHL teams. And they just picked the guy who they think is the best value for what they're getting paid on their team. So with all the signings going on and all these trades and talking about the same kind of things over and over, I thought it'd be interesting to do that, but with a slightly different approach. I decided to go through on roster resource and just go through the rosters in the contracts and what players were making and pick the worst contracts on every team. So I went through all 31 teams division by division and picked the what I think is the worst contract on each team. Um, so I'm going to go through all of them, and I'll warn you, this video, I don't know how long it's going to end up. Might be a bit of a long one because I'm going through all 31 teams. But if this is something that interests you, please stay tuned because this is certainly an interesting thing to look at. Also, if you're not yet a subscriber to this channel, please hit that subscribe button. If you are a fan of the NHL or hockey in general, there are videos here for you. Whether you like a certain team or you just follow the league as a whole, there's stuff here for you to watch that you're going to enjoy. So if you're not yet a subscriber, please hit that subscribe button. So, alright, let's get going first with the Atlantic Division. The Tampa Bay Lightning, Ryan Callahan, he's making $5.8 million through 2020, and he is already 33 years old. He is a fourth-line player at this point. You don't get much offense out of him. If he was still a second-line player like he was with the Rangers, that $5.8 million is fine. But where he's at now in his career as an injury-prone fourth-liner, his contract is not very good. Boston, David Backes, 34 years old. He's making $6 million a year through 2021. Backes to Boston has been a disaster so far. He has not been the player that anyone hoped when he went to Boston he would be. His body is breaking down. He's 34 years old, and he's not been even close to worth $6 million. He's a third-line player at this point. He's got to focus on just playing a full season, never mind doing anything, getting to 25 goals or anything like that. I really liked Backes in St. Louis. I thought he was a great player. I loved his style of play. I was really excited when he came to Boston, but so far it's not been good for Backes as a Bruin, and his contract is one of the worst in the league, I think. Toronto, I had none for Toronto. I looked through and there was nothing that jumped off the page at me as overly bad with the Maple Leafs. I'm sure that's probably going to change now that they're... maybe it won't change now that they're going to be so tight up against the cap once all these kids' ELCs run out. And they have Tavares at $11 million a year. I'm not going to count that as a bad contract because he certainly could end up worth that if he puts up enough points. So nothing really jumped off the page in Toronto as bad. Florida, Jamie McGinn. Jamie McGinn is making $3.3 million a year. He's 30 years old. He's really a third or fourth liner at this point. He's not the player that he used to be. He is not worth over $3 million a year. Luckily for Florida, next year's it. His contract's up in the summer of 2019, so they only have one more year of McGinn, at least at McGinn at that price. Detroit had a ton of them to pick from. You really could have gone a number of different ways with Detroit, but I went Justin Abdelkader. He's 31 years old and he is making $4.25 million through 2023. That is a disgusting contract for a player that really has not done much the last few years. He's gotten hurt a lot, and he is not the point-producing power forward that Detroit thought they had when he first came up into the league. That's a gross contract in Detroit. Montreal was another team with plenty of different ways to go, especially on their back end. Their defense is putrid, but I went Jeff Petrie. I know Andrew Shaw would have been a popular pick there, but Jeff Petrie at $5.5 million a year through 2021. He's already 30 years old. He's just not that good. Petrie is a 4 through 6 defenseman on pretty much every other team in the league. Montreal has one of the worst defense cores in the entire NHL. They certainly make a case for the worst. And he's not worth anything close to $5.5 million a year. Ottawa, this was a pretty easy one. Bobby Ryan's making $7.25 million a year through 2022. No wonder Ottawa wants to dump that contract on whoever they trade Erik Karlsson to. He's already 31 years old. He's not even close to the player that he used to be. He had a good playoffs a couple years ago when Ottawa went to the conference final. But even that regular season, he was pretty bad. And then last year was a total disaster for everyone in Ottawa. Bobby Ryan is not worth anything close to that. Buffalo, Kyle Okposo. There were a couple of options in Buffalo, but Okposo at $6 million a year through 2023. Still got a long time left on that deal. He's 30 years old, and his entire time in Buffalo has been a huge disappointment. He was so good for the Islanders, such an important player for the Islanders. Then he left in free agency, got this huge deal from the Sabres, and he struggled with his health. He's struggled to put points on the board and score goals. He just has not been what they expected, and that's a very bad contract right now for Buffalo. Luckily for them, they're not close to the salary cap, so it doesn't matter as much. Washington. Washington didn't have any terrible contracts, but I decided to put Matt Niskanen on here. His contract goes through 2021 at $5.75 million per year. He's 31 years old. Now, I like Niskanen as a defenseman. He's a solid player, but he doesn't do anything overly great. He's not great offensively. He's not great defensively. He's kind of just pretty good everywhere. And at $5.75 million, I want a little more than pretty good. So I think Niskanen's a bit overpaid in Washington. In Pittsburgh, Chris Letang. Chris Letang is not even close to the player that he was going back 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. Late 2000s, he was really coming into his own and becoming a superstar in the league. Early 2010s, you could make a case that he was worth a ton of money. He is not anymore. He's injury prone now. He's 31 years old. He's making $7.25 million per year through 2022. He's just not worth that at this point. He's not the player that he was 5+ years ago. Injuries have taken their toll, and he's starting to really decline. So Letang in Pittsburgh is a rough contract. Philadelphia, Philly didn't have too many overly bad ones, but this one really stuck out. Yuri Laterra is making $4.7 million. He was a fourth liner for them last year. He stinks now. He is really bad. And he is making almost $5 million a year. He's 30 years old. Luckily for Philly, this contract's up after this year, so he'll be gone after this upcoming season or re-sign at a much, much lower price. But Laterra is not worth anything close to that. Another really bad deal for a fourth liner, Columbus, Brandon Dubinsky. Columbus had a few options here, but I think Dubinsky is by far the worst. He's 32 years old. He is a bottom 6 center at this point. He's penciled in on roster resource as the fourth line center in Columbus. He's making $5.85 million through 2021. I cannot imagine paying almost $6 million a year for a fourth line player. I don't think Dubinsky has ever been worth $5.85 million per year, but back in the day, back in his Ranger days and early Columbus days, he was certainly a very valuable, tough two-way center who could play as your second or third line guy. And he was a valuable guy there. But now at this point he's injury prone. He's 32 years old, and he is not worth anything close to $5.85 million a year. His offensive production, for the most part, is dried up at this point. That's a terrible contract. New Jersey, I had none. Nothing really stuck out with New Jersey as overly bad. I think Travis Zajac might be a bit overpaid at this point, but it's not an egregiously bad deal, so I put none for that. Carolina, I also put none. Nothing stuck out there as a gross contract. Like, I cannot believe that guy's making that much. So next up is the New York Islanders. They had quite a few options with the Islanders, basically their entire fourth line, but I decided to go a different direction. I went with Andrew Ladd, because Andrew Ladd is 32 years old, and he is making $5.5 million a year through 2023. Ladd largely has been a huge disappointment with the Islanders. He had some great years with Winnipeg. He came up with Chicago before that and was an important player for the Blackhawks in their early Cup days. But he's not worth anything close to that now. He's basically a third liner at this point, and $5.5 million for a third liner for a number of more years is a very bad contract. So that's a rough deal for the Islanders. For the Rangers, Mark Stahl. Somehow Mark Stahl is only 31 years old. I found that extremely surprising when I looked it up. But it feels like he's been around forever. But even at 31, Mark Stahl is already on a sharp decline as far as his play is concerned. I mean, talk about a guy who is not even close to the same player that he was in, say, 2010 or around there. His play has fallen off a cliff quite a bit with the Rangers, and he's making $5.7 million a year through 2021. So they got three more years on that deal, and at a very high cap hit. So that's a pretty bad deal. Switching over to the West now. Nashville, I didn't have any for Nashville. I think nothing jumped out at me as overly bad with the Predators. So Winnipeg, I have Dmitry Kulikov. There were a couple of options with Winnipeg, but Kulikov is making $4.3 million through 2020, so for 2 more years. He just hasn't been the player that he was supposed to be. He's only 27, so he should theoretically be right in the prime of his career. He's only 27 years old, but he wasn't very good in Buffalo. Now, granted, that could be because it's Buffalo. He had a mediocre year last year, had injury issues. He's just not the player that he was supposed to be when he came into the league. And $4.3 million, I think, is too high for a guy like that. Minnesota, this should be obvious, Zach Parise. Zach Parise is making a little over $7.5 million a year through 2025. He still has years left on this deal. He's already 34 years old, and he has had massive injury problems really since he's gone to Minnesota. The kid was an absolute stud in New Jersey, so you can't blame Minnesota for giving him this contract, but it's been all downhill since then. Massive back problems, injuries every year. He's just completely declined because of his health, and he's not worth anything close to that now. Now he's already 34, and you have him for till 2025. Are you kidding me? He's going to be almost 40 when this contract's up. It's a terrible contract for Minnesota. Colorado, Carl Soderberg is making $4.75 million per year through 2020. That is ridiculous in my book. He's 32 years old. I didn't like Soderberg when he was in Boston. He hasn't done anything spectacular in Colorado. He's at best a third-line center, I think, and that's just a bad overpayment for someone who's really not that good, I think. St. Louis, there was a number to choose from in St. Louis, but I decided to go with Alexander Steen because he's already 34 years old and he's making $5.75 million per year through 2021. Almost $6 million a year for a guy who I think is going to struggle to reach 50 points for the rest of his career. He did not reach 50 points last year. I don't think he does this year or probably ever again. He's an older player now on the decline. He's almost 35, and that's really when players start to go the other way. Usually, is right around 35, 36. So I cannot see Alex Steen being worth $5.75 million a year. I'm sure he's a great leader. He's been around a long time. He's a great guy to have in the locker room, but the point production just isn't there for the salary at this point. Dallas. This one was a no-brainer. Jason Spezza is making $7.5 million next year. He's a third-line center. $7.5 million for a 35-year-old third-line center. Now, luckily for Dallas, this is the last year of that contract, and he'll be gone after this year. But still, that's ridiculous. Spezza is obviously nothing like what he was 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago. He's not that at all. That's a terrible contract. Luckily, it's almost over. And Chicago, this was also a team that had tons of opportunity. I could have picked any number of players from Chicago. Brent Seabrook's contract is gross. Duncan Keith is on a sharp decline. So some of the guys there are making ridiculous money. Talk about a team that won a lot of cups, falling in love with those players and paying them more than they're worth. Chicago is a big example of that. Luckily for them, they got 3 cups out of the deal. But for me, Chicago is Jonathan Toews, no doubt. $10.5 million per season through 2023 for Jonathan Toews. Now, Toews is only 30 years old, so year-wise, or age-wise, that's not that bad of a deal. But Jonathan Toews' play has been on a sharp decline the last 2 years. He is nowhere near the player that he was a few years ago when Chicago was winning cups. Not even close. He was downright bad last year, and I really don't see it going the other way. I think he's past his prime at 30 years old now. He had some incredibly good years in Chicago, but they're over, and now he's locked into this contract, which is good for him. He's making over $10 million a year, but for Chicago, he is locked into this contract at over $10 million a year for a number of more seasons through 2023. So what's that, like 4 more years? That's bad. Toews that's a terrible contract for Chicago. And finally, we move to the Pacific. Vegas, it's Tomas Tatar. He's making $5.3 million through 2021. He's just not even close to worth that anymore. His last couple years in Detroit were atrocious. He didn't really do much once traded to Vegas at the end of last year. He really didn't do anything since moving over. He's only 27 years old, so I guess that gives you some hope that maybe he'll get back to being a 25-goal scorer. But I think Tatar is one of the more overrated players and certainly overpaid players at this point in the league. Not worth it at all. But again, Vegas is a team that's not up against the cap, so it's really not a big deal for them that they're overpaying him. They'll just be happy when this deal runs out. San Jose, I had nobody in San Jose. Maybe Joe Thornton's not worth $5 million a year anymore. Maybe Evander Kane ends up not being worth $7 million a year, but that's an if, because I think there's just as much of a chance that he could end up being worth that and become a 30-goal scorer every year. So I didn't have anyone in San Jose. There were some maybes, but no one really stuck out as really bad. Anaheim, this is a team with some bad contracts. But the one that really stuck out to me is Corey Perry. Oh my God. $8.625 million per year through 2021 for Corey Perry, who didn't even have 20 goals last year or the year before. I mean, he has been talk about an overrated player. Perry's got to be up there for one of the most overrated players in the entire league. He scored 50 goals once, which was years ago now. That was like what, 2010, 11 or something like that. And he has been nothing even close to that since then. I think he had an 80-plus point season after that 1 year, but lately he's been, I mean, he hasn't even gotten to 20 goals in the past 2 years. I mean, he's not worth anything even close to that. He's a third-line player at this point. He is a 15 to 20 goal third-line player at this point, and he is making over $8.5 million a year. Talk about a terrible, terrible contract. He's 33 years old. He's not getting any younger. He's not going to get any better. He is what he is at this point. This is a massive, massive overpayment by Anaheim, who is overall an old team and on the decline, I think. And Perry's contract is just awful. Without a doubt, one of the most overrated players in the league. Speaking of overrated players, we get to LA now, and we have Dion Phaneuf making $7 million a year through 2021. He's 33 as well, and this is another gross contract. Phaneuf is, I've never liked Dion Phaneuf. I've always thought he's been a complete pylon on the back end. You might as well just put a traffic cone back there. He'd probably do a better job. But, yeah, Phaneuf is not very good. He's always been overrated. His time in Toronto was terrible. He was extremely overrated there. Now he's in LA. He's making $7 million somehow. I don't know how. I mean, I wouldn't pay Phaneuf $5 million a year. I'd want him under $5 a year. Never mind $7. It's just a terrible contract. Another bad 33-year-old with past success this time. This is in Calgary. We have Troy Brouwer, successful in Chicago, successful in Washington. He went to St. Louis for a year and had a pretty good year. Now he's in Calgary. He's 33 years old, making $4.5 million a year through 2020, so 2 more years. And he's a fourth liner. He is a fourth line player in Calgary at this point. He is nothing like what they thought they were getting when they signed him. He's not a 20 goal scorer anymore. He's not an effective power forward anymore. He is a fourth liner making $4.5 million a year. Terrible contract. Edmonton, this one's a no-brainer. Milan Lucic, 30 years old, making $6 million a year through 2023. Disgusting. Milan Lucic stinks now. He is not even close to the player that he was a year, 5, 6, 7 years ago. He downright stinks now. He had less than 15 goals last year. Like, what? I don't know how. I mean, I thought this was a huge overpayment when Edmonton signed him. Typical Peter Chiarelli, falling in love with a guy that he won a cup with in Boston. Just awful contract. Edmonton is stuck with this for numerous more years now. 4 more years? Just disgusting. And they're not going to be able to move it because nobody in their right mind is going to take on this contract. So Lucic is going to be stuck in Edmonton and getting extremely overpaid. Vancouver, Louis Eriksson, signed the same year. Louis Eriksson is 33 years old, making $6 million a year through 2022. He has never been the same since he got concussed by a hit by John Scott when he was in Boston. He's not been close to the same player since then. He's just not very good anymore. He's certainly declining. And they've got him for a number of more years. And at $6 million a year, that is just way too much for what Louis Eriksson gives you at this point. And lastly, the Arizona Coyotes. Marcus Kruger is making over $3 million next year. Luckily for Arizona, they're not even close to having any cap issues, and they're trying to spend to the cap floor, never mind the cap ceiling. He's only 28 years old, but Marcus Kruger wasn't even in the NHL for most of last year. His career has really gone downhill. He was such a bright spot with Chicago when they were winning Stanley Cups. He was their fourth line center, great penalty killer, such an important depth piece to that team. But since then, it's been nothing good for Marcus Kruger. And now he's making over $3 million a year to be Arizona's fourth line center. And like I said, he struggled to even stay in the league last year. He's just not very good at this point. It will be interesting to see if he even stays up in Arizona or if he gets waived or something. He's certainly not worth over $3 million a year. Luckily for the Coyotes, though, his contract's up after this season. So there you have it. Those are who I picked to be the worst contract on each team in the NHL. I know this was a long video, almost half an hour. Wow. But this was a fun one to look at, an interesting one to look at and do. There are some really, really bad contracts out there. And, I applaud the GMs for what they did this free agency because none of the contracts that were signed this free agency really stuck out to me as bad or like, holy crap, you're giving him what? Sure, they weren't all great, but then nothing stuck out as egregiously bad. And as we've seen in years past, there have been some egregiously bad contracts handed out. So that's what I think. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Did I get them right? Or was there anyone I missed with a really bad deal that should have been in place of who I did put for that team? Do you think anyone on there isn't a bad contract? Although I don't know how you could know much about the NHL and think that these contracts weren't bad. But just let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Like, comment, share, subscribe, follow on social media, check out offthewallhockey.com. All those links in the description below. Keep spreading the word about this channel. Let's keep this thing growing. Thank you so much for watching. If you made it all the way here to the end, I really applaud you. Just thank you for watching, and I'll talk to you guys soon. This was a fun one to do, but a long one to do.